So thanks everyone for coming. My name is Andres Gannon, and along with Chelsea Estancona, we run the online Peace Science Colloquium. This colloquium was started in 2015 as part of the annual meeting of the Peace Science Society International, and the goal is to celebrate the excellent research that happens both before and after the annual Peace Science Society meeting, and to share it with the wider community. We have the website that's hosted at UNT right now, where we have more information about the society and memberships and the conference that's hosted. Today, we have a paper entitled What Makes an Atrocity a Genocide? Thresholds in Public Perception by Rachel Schoner et al. Of Tulane University. We have two great discussants, Matthew Krain and Daniel Solomon, who are going to be providing feedback and have read the paper in advance. The basics of participation is Rachel will present the paper for about 15 minutes. We'll have each discussant give comments and feedback, big picture things for the first 5 or so minutes, and then any other thoughts or suggestions for Rachel. After both discussants have spoken, we'll invite Rachel to give sort of comments on the comments and any feedback or takeaways from the things that happened there. And we'll open up the queue to people that would like to comment. So you can use the Q&A function or the raise hand function for those of you in the audience, or you can drop some comments in the chat, and we'll sort of have that as part of a discussion and a back and forth with Rachel, the two discussants, and feedback that those in the audience have given. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen and pull up my slides to share.
Looks good.
Okay, full screen now. Good to go?
Yep.
Okay, thanks so much, Andres, and all the team for organizing and for the two discussants. I'm presenting a joint project with Rachel, who's also here at LSU, here just for a little bit, and then with Daniel Arnon as well at the University of Arizona. And so we're going to talk first about the motivation, kind of the background of this. This is part of a larger project that I'll end on kind of talking about where we see this moving forward. This is very early stages, so we're really excited for any and all feedback that you have. So this all came together when I was at a conference with these folks, and we were talking about genocide and especially the ongoing debates about what's been happening in Gaza, about whether that's a genocide. And we realized as scholars, we have different definitions of what is a genocide. Me coming from the international legal perspective, I think of the legal definition, but other folks that are more on the political violence side can have other definitions of genocide. And so with these ongoing debates, this has very much been in the public discourse with actors such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International chiming in and covering, especially more recently, coalescing around the agreement that these events are a genocide. And this has been ongoing, but this isn't the only event. Also, there's been a lot of coverage about Gaza in particular, but we know this is also kind of a bias in our Western media with conflicts such as Ethiopia and Tigray and Darfur, Sudan right now going on, as well as the discourse since the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well, about whether these mass atrocities are a genocide. There's been different coverage of what do we call these mass atrocities. And so that's where this all started, is that what is a mass atrocity, when is it a genocide? So that's a motivation and where we're coming from. And so we just had questions, and we realized that when we were looking in the literature, we couldn't find answers about kind of what do people think of as genocide, that we were kind of surprised that there was no kind of work on this that we could find. And so we want to find out and get these answers. So again, this legal definition that I'll present, I'll kind of put up from the Genocide Convention, that this differs from what some scholars think of as genocide from a non-legal perspective, but also what the public thinks of in the discourse and kind of this folk definition, this colloquial definition. And so the differing opinions and perspectives about what is genocide is the motivation for this project. And so the public then, like I mentioned, with all of these different actors weighing in, is trying to determine, is this a genocide or not, specifically in Gaza, but this isn't the only incident. And so what we put here is the Google Trends searches. And so what we can see is not only do we have these experts, these NGOs,
Sorry,
these
Rachel, I think we can
non-governmental.
still only see the first title slide for some reason.
What? No, you can't only see the first title slide.
Yes.
I've been going through so many slides.
I once you got to the figures, I figured.
Um, Let me try again. Let's see. Can you,
Yes,
okay,
now I see a motivation slide.
can you see, let me try to, can you see me moving now?
Yes.
Okay, so what I had shown you before that I'll just click through is kind of the ongoing evolution of public discourse with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all of these things. So this is the slide that I was on about the Google Trends. And so what we see is not only do we have kind of this top-down discourse about genocide over the years, but we also have the public searching for the term genocide. This is Google Trends over the last few years, and what we see is spikes with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also Israel and Gaza, what's been happening. And if you track those, you can see also it spikes when we have kind of increased famine and kind of atrocities happening within that conflict as well. Okay, sorry. Okay, so then the research question then with this motivation is then under what conditions do individuals label an atrocity a genocide? And kind of if we understand this more, we can understand how and why this might differ from scholarship or legal definitions as well. So what I'm going to present to you today is this inductive theory that we're going to have with the pre-analysis plan, and we plan to pilot this in the United States in early spring of this following year. But this is part of a larger project that I'll talk about in the last slide, that we're trying to theorize more about how this may differ across nationally, that I'll talk about at the end. Okay, so as I mentioned, there is a very clear legal definition, and so I put this up on the screen. This is from the Genocide Convention that has been adapted in international law. For example, the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court takes this exact definition, and so I'll highlight the three main components of this definition. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with mainly intent to destroy is a very big part of this, in whole or in part one of these protected groups that is listed, national, ethnical, racial, or religious, and then any of those acts such as killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, imposing measures intended to prevent births, forcible transfer of children, and so on. And this was a little bit different actually than Raphael Lemkin's original conception of genocide. So from the start, we have this evolution of the term genocide even, but this has been in the legal international law. This definition has maintained and it has not changed, but that doesn't mean it's been without critique as well. And so then we also have legal scholars' ongoing critique of this, but also we have scholars that are adding to it because of especially the protected groups. The intent to destroy is a very high bar, making terms such as femicide, politicide, things like that, because recognizing this doesn't capture everything of mass atrocity too. So it's a fairly narrow legal definition, especially at how it's been interpreted by legal tribunals and institutions internationally. And so kind of with that big picture, there is this recognition that this isn't the only way to think about genocide. And so what does the public think about it is what we're trying to ask here. And just note too, the Genocide Convention not only bans genocide, but also conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, and also complicity in genocide. So we're asking what people think with public opinion, and I'm going to acknowledge here that there's a lot of literature on public opinion. This is not my kind of expertise in this. I'm coming from the more international law side, but my co-authors know more about this than I do, and I'm just going to kind of mention that there's a lot of things that we know that drive public opinion, and we're not testing all of those, right? So there's large literatures on this. We know especially that elite cues matter. Kind of, I started with some of those examples of media organizations and NGOs and IGOs chiming in. So we're going to build that into it, but we know that elite cues matter. And also there's been a growing literature on public opinion on political violence, especially looking at violent strategies, nonviolent strategies, and how asking people to to condemn or justify violence as well. And also, some of this has been growing to look at how in-group biases in particular change or don't change these perceptions of both non-state and state actors, finding that in general, more violence does lead to stronger condemnation. And so we're speaking and building upon all of this literature, but really trying to think about how this literature that looks on political violence really changes or doesn't change when we think about mass atrocity and this genocide label as well, to understand the importance of this label. And so with this inductive theory, thinking back to also the legal definition in mass atrocities and political violence in general, we have the following expectations about variables that we think will increase the likelihood that an individual will label an atrocity as a genocide. First, the more severe an atrocity is, the more likely an individual will label it as a genocide. That should be pretty straightforward. We think, knowing from also the public opinion literature about elite queuing, that labeling by an external actor as genocide will also increase the likelihood. And thinking back, especially to this legal definition, the intent we're going to test as well. We're interested to see about this, that if there's a clear intent to eliminate a group, we think will also increase this likelihood. And so we're gonna think about and we're gonna test and vary the reasoning and justification that actors provide. So how are we testing this? Well, I told you we're interested in individuals and public opinion. So we're gonna run a survey, and specifically a vignette-based conjoint that gives anonymized and randomized vignettes describing an ongoing atrocity in an unspecified country. We're going to run this now in a US nationally representative sample, and it's going to be a forced choice. And so I'm going to walk you through these 6 attributes that we vary, as well as what a kind of sample vignette looks like and the outcomes as well. So we're going to randomize across 6 attributes: intent, organization, label, target, severity, and tactic. And so this is a table that is in the paper. I know it's a lot of text, but I'll just highlight a few things and also go back and show you what the example vignette that we currently have coded looks like. And so here we have these 6 attributes with intent about what these leaders are describing as kind of their goals and justifications, what's happening. For example, is it national security, or kind of really thinking through this intent to destroy and other justifications for it. This labeling, do these organizations label it as a genocide or not? The UN, international human rights groups, or the United States, the group identity, the tactics used, again, going back to this legal definition, not only killings, which most people think about, but these other forms of violence that happen in mass atrocities, as well as severity, how many people are affected as well. So here's an example of the current coding about this, what a vignette would look like is kind of in this news article format. And again, you don't have to read the language right now, but that's what it's going to look like when we vary these different attributes out along those levels. So that's the current survey design. And these are the 2 main outcomes that we're going to ask. The 2 questions after each vignette is a forced choice about whether that one vignette is a genocide or not a genocide. But recognizing there's a limitation there, also ask respondents whether that vignette is likely to be a genocide on a Likert scale from not at all likely to extremely likely. So we have more variation there than just dichotomous. And especially since this is a pilot, we really want to know what people think about genocide and mass atrocities. And so we have a host of post-treatment questions that I'm happy to show in the Q&A, but these include policy preferences and feelings towards using genocide as a term as well, to really inductively understand individuals' perceptions of mass atrocities and when a mass atrocity is a genocide. And ethical concerns are always front and center when we study human rights, but especially when we do surveys and we talk to people about these mass atrocities. This is my, in full disclosure, first survey, so I'm learning a lot. But my co-authors that know this work much better than me have put together a section on ethical concerns, and really post with this post treatment, providing information to individuals about genocide, its definition with links to resources, as well as phone numbers for those that are emotionally impacted. So we have kind of that part as well that we're aware of that. And this should be pretty straightforward in terms of estimation and inference. I won't focus too much on that, but we've been running power calculations about what we think the power that we need in our sample size. And I want to highlight the robustness with especially attention checks. We've originally thought that we might do a pre-treatment vignette as well and things like that, but we've been narrowing down what are we're actually testing and varying. So we're going to do attention checks, saturation checks, and all that fun stuff. So to start concluding, we really want to know more that we couldn't find in the literature about how the public perceives genocide. This term of mass atrocities that's oftentimes the called the crime of all crimes, right? That there's something special or different when a mass atrocity is labeled a genocide. So we want to understand that process. This is inspired by and illuminates gaps between law, scholarship on law, but also scholarship on political violence and other scholarship and public cue taking. So we hope to learn more about this process. And especially this is going to help us have a baseline for further research in this space on public perceptions of mass atrocity and genocide labeling. Okay, so I mentioned at the outset that this is part of a larger project. And this is very, very early stages. It's only been a few months since we've started this. So any and all feedback is very much appreciated. I will solicit all kinds of questions and have lots of hopefully thoughts and inspiration for me to go back to the team with. So our next step is to finalize this pilot in the United States and do IRB, but we want to finalize this before about all of your awesome feedback. And again, this is an inductive first step. And where we see this going at the current moment is theoretically developing about specifically legacies and memorialization of political violence and how different populations conceive of political violence and mass atrocities and how that shapes how people think of as genocide. So specifically what we're thinking about doing is a cross-national sample surveys in the United States, Germany, and Argentina, thinking about how all of these three countries, specifically, but you can broaden this, right? Countries around the world, different populations and publics, have different experiences with mass atrocities or political violence that they've experienced either personally, but also as a public, kind of as a collective, as a group. And the US, Germany, and Argentina all have varying degrees of what they've experienced, but also not only their experiences, but how the collective memorialization and how the legacy has been kind of collectively memorialized institutionally, but also socially within these. So we've been thinking that through, and we think that's an interesting variable to theorize and explore. But we look forward to all of your questions and feedback and suggestions. So with that, I will stop talking and let the discussants chime in. And again, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel. We're turning it over to Matt Krain for discussants first, and then Daniel Solomon.
Great. Thank you so much. Great paper, really interesting project, both the short-term project and the longer-term project. Thinking about how people make decisions about whether or not something is a genocide, I think is actually a really important question. It's an important question for public policy reasons, for groups engaging in advocacy, thinking about what to highlight for news media, et cetera. So there's a lot of ways that in the paper you could potentially frame that. So I'd encourage you to think about as you move toward the larger project, you know, what are the goals here and what are you ultimately trying to do and who are you trying to speak to? But I think it's great, but you don't want to hear that from me. You want me to actually try to give you some other feedback. So I've got a few notes, some that I'll send you later. Let me just focus in my limited time on three key themes. Thinking about causal mechanisms, about how people make these decisions, thinking about labeling a little more carefully, and thinking about questions of external validity. So first off, I know you spend a lot of time up front. It's 6 pages in the manuscript talking about scholarly and legal definitions. I know why you're doing that. It's important But it takes up a lot of room in the paper, and I'm not sure you need to do it, although it is how you got to the paper. I actually think if you took that and cut it in half and used the other half instead to think a little more carefully about the causal mechanisms, about how people or why people might make these decisions based on severity or variations of evidence of intent or labeling, it would be a richer paper. I know you're thinking about this as an inductive project, but thinking about those causal mechanisms and a little bit more carefully theoretically, um, I think will help you identify that there's not necessarily an obvious answer to any of those hypotheses, that you could hypothesize in multiple directions, but also it might generate different post-survey questions or post-experimental questions that you want to ask. So I would just encourage you to think about that. A quick example, you might expect that more severity would lead people to be more likely to label something a genocide, but some of the psychology literature, the work of Paul Slovic and others, might suggest otherwise, right? That people get numbed at a certain point by the numbers. So I think paying a little more attention to the causal mechanisms up front is really helpful. Now, in the paper, and I can't remember if you said it here, you were focusing a lot more on what the facts were rather than how they were framed, right? You were kind of explicit that, hey, we're not really interested in framing. Well, I would argue you are interested in framing. When you start talking about labeling, either by the perpetrator or by external actors, the US, the UN, human rights groups, you are talking a little bit about framing and how they label things or how people see those labels should theoretically have framing effects. So I know why you're doing that because you don't want to get into the morass of framing, but the framing literature actually might really help you. And given the larger project that you're trying to situate this within, about memorialization, about collective memory, the focus of this cross-national comparative study is ultimately about, I think, socialization, framing effects. So shying away from it up front might not be the best strategy. Maybe leaning into it will give you a little theoretical leverage short term, but also long term. Um, so moving to some design questions, one of them about labeling. Um, I don't know in the table that you provide of the label of how you talk about labeling in the survey. Um, I'm not sure it makes sense to say that an organization has not labeled the events as a genocide or has labeled the events as serious human rights abuses, but not a genocide. Those are direct quotes from the table. Um, I don't know whether news reports typically don't talk about or talk about genocide in the negative, right? They usually talk about what is going on, right? So they might say they've labeled the events as human rights abuses, or they've labeled the events as extremely serious human rights abuses or extensive human rights abuses. And the reason I'm pointing this out is both for external validity's sake, but also because of concerns about priming. If you tell them that an external actor has said it's not a genocide, that's like a piece of information you wouldn't normally expect to see in a news article, or at least I wouldn't expect to see that. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe a quick tour of some of the articles that describe extreme human rights abuses that fall short of genocide might reveal how news articles actually talk about that. But I think you ought to think intentionally about those choices. Um, some other external validity issues. One of them, I think, speaks to this question about causal mechanisms and how people make decisions about what is or isn't a genocide. Can one news item with limited but very specific information help people make this really fraught, complex determination, given the weight of the term genocide in the cultural milieu? I mean, maybe it can, but I'm not sure it can. And as I think about the conversations that I hear among students, among family, among colleagues about ongoing instances of atrocities, they're typically thinking about and drawing from a variety of different pieces of information, right? Multiple news stories. There's a lot of reasons why certain cases get labeled genocide and others don't. Obviously, these are, there's racial components and a whole, but I think the frequency with which we have information about the atrocities plays a role. So I just want to push you to think about um, whether or not one article that provides just basic information is enough to really push people to make that determination. I think I'm less concerned about that for the Likert scale dependent variable, but I worry that the forced choice is going to be kind of artificial, right? As a way to pick that up. And so thinking a little bit about what we should expect people to think about in making those determinations might be important. The other thing is the news story that you have. Um, is that a little too factual, a little too clinical? As I think about news stories about these kind of events, they typically have a little more language that is a little more vivid, maybe a quote, a picture. Now, I know you can't include all of those things, and I know you're trying to leave some of that out. But again, thinking about external validity and causal mechanisms, what are the things that actually push people to make that determination, might help you identify whether or not what you have there is sufficient. I've got other comments. In particular, I think page 23 in the manuscript is the first place you mention the pretreatment conditions. That seems like something you want to talk about maybe a little earlier, and some other more technical things. But I'll stop there. I know, obviously, we'll have time to talk more about this. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
On to me. Okay, great. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss this paper, and I appreciate coming after Matt, both because he's Matt and also because I think he raised some really terrific comments that I'll try to build on. I want to start with a caveat that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and that my opinions don't represent the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum or the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Also, this is Eli. I think first comment is I totally agree with Matt that this is a framing paper. I really think you need to lean into that. Like, this is sort of straight Benford and Snow, effects of social movement frames on public attitudes and political mobilization. And so, I think the way that I think about the use of the term genocide, in addition to the sort of ontological debates among scholars and also the like secular public attitudes, is basically as a consequence of sort of social movement contention. I think we can tell a story that you have a number of plausible instances of large scale group targeted violence that are happening all at the same time. That there some of those instances receive attention from social movements as sort of objects of contention, and then a further subset of those cases that receive attention from social movements then get the kind of media attention around the is it or is it not question in a way that generates the kind of Google trends that you're observing. And so I think even starting with the argument that this has been a topic of debate in large part because of the protest movement around atrocities in Gaza, is an important way of kind of anchoring the discussion in something other than this is an important topic for academics and we need to figure out how to reconcile these different perspectives among academics. So I think that's the first start, and I would even the crowd counting consortium has a bunch of really interesting data about basically topics that were mentioned in protests around the country since 2017. And I know because I've sort of played around with this data, there are lots of sort of observations there that talk about genocide, both in the context of Ukraine and then also in Gaza. And so I feel like that might be a more compelling sort of starting point if you want to give the cross-country view of how these issues are represented in contention. Second point, I think there has been some work on this.
I just drawing attention to a paper I didn't see cited, which is not especially widely cited, but Valentino and Weinberg, I think, in a 2017 special issue of the Journal of Human Rights that focused explicitly on public opinion and human rights issues, talk about genocide frames, and they're sort of thinking about the set of questions. I think in some similar ways to the way that you are, but in slightly different ways, just focusing very narrowly on the term. And so would encourage you to just sort of dig into that work, as well as I think that just going with the kind of forward reference search from that paper gives you a number of different papers on the effects of human rights frames on public attitudes. So I know Ryan Liu has recently published some of this work in ISQ. Kelly Żrabko and Stephen Chowden have also published on sort of adjacent questions of human rights versus national security frames. So would just encourage you to make sure you're kind of in conversation with those pieces. Third point is really two subpoints on the theory. The first is I'm not totally convinced by the in-group, out-group framing, to frame this in like classic IR terms. I think we probably have sort of a two-level game here, right? Where on the one hand, you have communication among various international institutions and INGOs about the concept of genocide. But then you also have that layered on top of an environment of like domestic political polarization, which then also reflects back onto the question of the whether the person who's listening to the speaker actually trusts what the speaker's saying and trusts the frames that they're offering. So we're just sort of in keeping with Matt's comment about the causal mechanisms, would just encourage you to think a little bit more about the like strategic communication question here, and to what extent we can believe that diverse types of people within your sample actually believe what the speaker's saying. I think that if just to take the sort of polarized extremes, if I'm a Democrat and I'm listening to conservative Republican talk about risks of genocide against white South Africans, I might view that differently than a conservative Republican who's listening to the same thing. Likewise, if I'm a conservative Republican listening to a Democrat talk about genocide against the Palestinian people, that's a sort of different calculation. So I think it's worth thinking about both the mechanism there, but then also how that might break down among sort of theoretically relevant subgroups within your analysis. And then I know I'm over time, so I would encourage you to do a pre-treatment vignette, just to like a control vignette, basically, to talk about some, maybe it's conflict in the particular country, or some other information that might be before you introduce the idea that there is violence taking place, so that you can do the comparison between how people view the violence without genocide and how they view the violence with the genocide label attached to it. And I think you only get that if you have the kind of control comparison. And then lastly, on the empirics, I would just I think leaning into the unique characteristics of the individual country rather than anonymizing the country is, to me, a more credible empirical strategy. I think otherwise you kind of leave the person to put names on country A and country B, and I would rather you maybe pick like a low salience country, I don't know, the Gambia or something like that, a country where you don't think that there's a good reason why Americans think about that country a lot, but there are nonetheless sort of credible risks of violence. And in my mind, that is more compelling than, sorry for the baby, more compelling than the strategy of just sort of pretending like you're ignoring the sort of cognitive biases that people bring to these descriptions.
Great. Thank you so much to Matt and Daniel for the feedback. In a minute now, we'll turn it over to Rachel to give some sort of reflections or thoughts on the comments that have been given. At this time, I'll invite people that are in the audience to join the queue. You can raise your hand if there's questions or comments that you have or things that you'd like to ask Rachel. You can also drop a comment in the chat as well, and I'll sort of manage that Q&A. But Rachel, we'll turn it back over to you now and have sort of a free-flowing discussion with Daniel and Matt on their feedback as we see what comments come in from folks in the audience.
Great, thanks. And I will note Daniel, who's co-author, is also here now, so he can correct me if I say anything wrong too. But I won't take up too much time responding. I just want to collect a ton. And so I just want to shout out and say thank you again to Matt and Daniel for those really helpful comments. I very much appreciate especially the literature that you mentioned, Daniel, that I saw Matt also nodding his head too, because that's kind of what I wanted to start and kind of acknowledge that like this is outside a lot of ours. Like you guys are more in this space than we are, so we try to do our very due diligence quickly, learning this. So we will definitely speak in conversation with that. This has been an ongoing kind of debate about what do we actually want to do in this survey, right? About pre-treatment vignettes and kind of narrow it down. And so, we're yeah, and about the framing. So you've given us a lot to think about. So I think I will just say thank you so much. And if you have more, we will take it all.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. So we have two people in the queue so far. Ernest, we'll start with you, and then we'll turn it over to Shanna.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for coming late. So my name is Ernest. I'm an assistant professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach. So I'm from Nigeria, and my research focuses on sub-Saharan Africa. So beginning of November, there was a threat from Donald Trump about genocide against Christians in Nigeria. So some Nigerians say it is a welcome development for an intervention, but others argue that there is no genocide against Christians in Nigeria. And they also further say that that the number of casualties does not amount to genocide, but the intent. So the question is, if all the Christians in Nigeria are killed, so if number is not the issue and it is the intent, so is that a genocide or not?
Is that a question for me? You want me to answer? I mean, that's the whole point is like lawyers would say one thing, right? It's really about the intent and that's litigated, but other people would say different things. And so that's what we want to understand, right? Because we know what lawyers think. We know what the international kind of tribunals think, but that's not. And I like that you bring this up and we're hearing this rhetoric of genocide, not only kind of the strategic use of this too, right? And so we want to unpack that. So kind of we take that as motivation to figure this out as well.
Great. Thank you, Ernest. Now over to Shanna.
Hi, Rachel. And co-authors. This is really interesting. I think lots to think about here. I have two sort of questions. One is, I didn't hear this and I apologize if it was there, but there's some literature that like willingness to label human rights abuses or sort of think that they're serious is also colored by who the perpetrator is. And that also feels very maybe pertinent to this particular moment, right, of our conversations around genocide here in the US at least. That might be something to think about varying also, right? I think maybe like less salient if you are going with like something that people don't have as strong opinions about, like the Gambia scenario, right? But maybe something to think about sort of moving forward. And then the second thing is just, this is, I think, your like long-term thing, but for the kind of institutionalized collective memory, Rwanda is crazy interesting in that respect, right? There is like an official national narrative, right? You are not allowed to deviate from it, right? And it is very sort of top down, very regimented. And that might be an interesting case to look at as really different than those other cases that you kind of had in the hopper. So yeah, super cool. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Great, thanks. And I'll, Daniel, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, can I
Yeah.
jump in? I just think that like if you guys have some money to throw at us, we'll investigate all of the questions that you want us to ask. I think that we are limited in our resources, and we want to start from the place that makes the most sense. And I think that that's kind of like the fact that there is so much interest and there is so many ways to do it. The framing that we're kind of coming at it at this point is like, what is the contribution that is new? And in many ways, the perpetrator side of the equation is something that has been done a lot on. And so we're kind of shying a little bit away from it, A, because getting through the review process when we start naming the perpetrator and doing it in the moment of the now is going to be much, much harder. And I just have a lot of experience in trying to push papers through that deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it is almost it is a torturous process. I'll just say that. And so right now we're trying to get this on the agenda, and the way to do that is actually shying away from the perpetrator. So I like what Daniel was suggesting of like taking a low salience country earlier. I came in at the tail end of it. So like we're because there has been a lot of work on that front, we kind of know what to expect, right? Like, and so yes, it's probably happening on lower levels of violence, not at this level, but we know that the biases of naming the country will matter, and so that's going to affect, and this is higher salient, and so there's just less of a contribution to be made there. If you want to give us another 20 grand, we'll throw that in there too, but if you don't have that, we're going to try to maximize the contribution at the front end of where we can kind of make a difference. And so one of the angles that we're trying to go at this, and I'm sure Rachel mentioned this, is to kind of and yeah, we're still kind of looking through the cases, and there's a lot of really interesting cases, right? Like Rwanda would be really, really interesting. Turkey might be really, really interesting. And so we're really trying to think conceptually at this stage on what it is that we're trying to make the biggest contribution that we can do with the limited resources that we have. And then once we get that on the agenda, we can build it out to the other sides of the equation. So that's why we're like, it's intentional on our part. We thought we've put a lot of thought into the perpetrator. It's where we started, obviously, kind of like just in the moment and in the zeitgeist of it all right now. And as we went down drilling through that thought process, we were like, actually, it doesn't make sense to go down that route because there is a lot of literature on it. And so we kind of want to talk about a broader process of kind of a the gap that exists between the legal, the political science, and the folk definitions, as we're kind of calling it in the paper, and then kind of thinking about historical memories and how they shape them. So that's kind of where we're at right now at this stage of the project. Yeah, but thank you. That is definitely something that we put a lot of thought into, and that's why we're actually shying away from it, just because we don't feel that there's a big bang for the buck in doing another paper on, yeah, people are biased based on how they think of country X versus country Y, or perpetrator X versus perpetrator Y. That's kind of been done in many, many ways. And so there's just not a lot of addition to it except for the label of genocide on it, which is heavier, obviously, but it just doesn't add that much more to the literature in our view at this state at this point in time.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. And Rachel, over to Lawrence.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the great presentation. So I'm Lawrence Wucher at the Simon Scott Center at the Holocaust Museum alongside Daniel Solomon. So this is particularly interesting, partly because we're actually in the midst of a similar project, planning a survey experiment on closely related questions as part of some broader public opinion research or survey research. So sympathetic to all of the difficulties of like having to narrow down to only a certain set of questions and the trade-offs that come with every choice you make in designing this kind of project. But just wanted to mention that we're doing something similar. So happy to talk more in the particulars around that. We might be a little bit ahead of you in terms of our plan. We're probably going to get in the field in January if all goes well. But I guess I wanted to note that our motivation as an institution working not in an academic space, but working on trying to understand and expand policy support for genocide and mass atrocity prevention. The motivation is largely from trying to understand how conceptions of genocide and labeling of genocide affects support for policies and actions to prevent and respond to these atrocities. So it seems like it would be quite straightforward for you to just add a question or two at the end of asking, probing people's support for different kinds of actions to respond. And that was also the Valentino and Weinberg study that was mentioned is very squarely focused on that. And I mean, their findings are basically that there were no significant differences across genocide and non-genocide arms in any kind of support for different kinds of actions. I think one of the interesting things is like that's counter to the, at least my sense of the perceptions of elites, government officials, and others in the kind of foreign policy space. One place you can, I think, find some good discussion. This is in a report that we commissioned a few years ago, which I'll drop the link in the chat, by former State Department lawyer and another former State Department official that really is focused on how the US government goes about making determinations of genocide. But there's a discussion there of like, what does genocide mean in legal terms and how does it relate to public perceptions? I think they assert some things about public perceptions that we probably would say are still somewhat open questions. But I think it gets a little bit into the discussions of what the significance of a US government determination of genocide is. And I think it's all kind of related to what you're probing, but maybe you could add some things in, if you're able to, that would help shed some additional light on these kind of elite public interactions. Last thing is just a question about your sample. If you can just talk a little bit about what your plans are for how you're fielding this. And I think I heard you say you're planning to do it with a nationally representative sample. Given that it's an experiment, I wonder whether, like, how important you think it is to have this be a truly nationally representative sample as opposed to a high quality but not truly nationally representative sample. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I'll let Daniel answer the last part of that, but we absolutely about the post-treatment questions that is on our radar to ask about kind of policy preference, like support for different actions. And we should chat more offline afterwards about kind of what you're doing. Absolutely. So we'll be in touch. But then Daniel knows more about the survey sample. I'll let him answer that.
Yeah, and just to follow up on Rachel, I'd love for us to chat a little bit more because if there's a lot of overlap between what we're doing, then it'll make sense for us to kind of talk a little bit before, like if you guys are on the verge of launching anyway, then if we can like take a bit of a different space from where you guys are going to be, that'll be helpful for both of us at the end of the day. So let's make sure to chat a little bit when we can find the time. In terms of the sample, I mean, it really is a question of funding at the end of the day for us. We're thinking about this in terms of, and again, I missed the first part of it. So Rachel, did you mention the kind of multi-site stuff that we're going to be planning on doing in the future? So it's more a calculation for us of how to spend limited resources rather than getting to the ideal. I'm totally happy with a convenient sample that is high quality rather than a nationally representative sample. It really is just going to depend on how much it's going to cost us and how to allocate the resources across the 3 sites that we're hoping to be doing in the next 6 months. But I don't think that there is anything particularly important about having a nationally representative sample as opposed to a high quality convenient sample. At the end of the day, they're going to tell us probably something the same, and it's just going to be a matter of allocation of resources in a limited way for us in terms of kind of how we're thinking about the sample and the launch and how to make sure that we have enough funding at the end of the day to get to the other sites as well. Because for me, as we've been digging down the project, like I think my expectation is, and that's why I was kind of surprised by what you mentioned. So I really do need to go dig into the Valentino and Weinberg paper that you mentioned. But my expectation is that like more violence means more genocide as far as the public is going to be concerned, right? Like there seems to me, based on my impressions, and so I'm kind of surprised by what you mentioned, that there's this like linear kind of like the more violency it is, the more genocide-y it is, kind of way of the public thinking about it, and that's what I expect to find. And so to me, the bigger push is kind of more how this interacts with the the way that the public in each place thinks about the concept of genocide. And so to me, the variation that we're hoping to push for in the multiple sites is kind of really going to hopefully shape the outcomes in ways that are going to be more interesting than just the pilot in the US. But if we end up running the pilot in the US and find that like that's not the case, and it is more like the Valentina Weinberg paper that you're describing, then we'll have to kind of reshuffle and rethink kind of how we're going to be doing the multi-site stuff before then. So that's kind of the thought process as we're thinking about it right now. But we should definitely chat a little bit more so that we're not expending resources on the same set of questions if you guys are going to be running something quite similar to this in January, which is kind of our timeline as well as it stands right now.
Great, thanks, Daniel. I want to, as we sort of wrap up, want to turn it back over to Matt and Daniel. If you want to give sort of from this discussion, what do you think are the one or two biggest takeaways or most important things for Rachel and co-author to sort of synthesize things, and then Rachel will give you a last word to say thank you, and we'll sort of wrap up there. So Matt, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just echo two of the points I made before. I think you need to think really carefully about how individuals make these decisions, and how that affects things. I mean, yes, the public opinion literature is going to be very helpful, but there's a psychology literature that's going to speak to that as well. I'd really encourage you to take a look at that. And the other thing is thinking about external validity. In terms of the stimulus, in terms of the experiment, I would just, really encourage you to think about those questions. Even though this is sort of a first launch or a pilot, it's going to affect the kind of questions you ask, and it's going to affect the direction it takes you, regardless of what you find. So, yeah, just encourage you to think about those things.
Yeah, I think building on that, and thanks to everyone for a great discussion. The takeaway for me, in addition to the discussion about the causal mechanisms, is maybe about both internal and external validity. Internal validity in the sense of making sure that you sort of have theorized how the effects that you expect to see might vary across different components of your sample, and then external being how the findings might extrapolate to different contexts that have a different political environment, different sort of social landscape than the United States. And just to bring back the Schwabgo and shadowing project, I think they've done some polling across maybe 5 different countries. Obviously, to Daniel's point about resources, with a healthy base of funding to support all of those surveys. But I think they do a great job in their work that I've seen published of trying to set up here's what we would expect in terms of perceptions of international institutions in the United States versus in South Africa, and why these might vary across cases. You're not always going to be able to sort of test those empirical intuitions, but to the extent that part of this work is trying to lay the foundation for understanding global attitudes towards genocide, and the relevance of genocide to our understanding of the sort of broader landscape of mass atrocities, giving both the scholarly community and practitioners who are kind of concerned about the public attitudes, as well as just the general public, some sense of why we might see different outcomes in different locations. A clearer conceptual roadmap, I think, will be really helpful in your project planning.
Well, I think this is my 10 seconds to say thank you again. No, this has been super helpful. I think we'll follow up with several of y'all. We'll be in touch, and you've given Daniel and Rachel and I much to think about. So thank you again so much, and thanks to Andres and the team for organizing. We really appreciate all your time and thoughtful feedback.
Great. Thanks to you, Rachel, for the advancement of science with the research you're doing, and thanks to Matt and Daniel for the feedback and thoughtful time and consideration. For the co-authors and others in the audience, you can go back and watch this video from the start on the YouTube channel if you missed the beginning of the presentation. And any questions or comments that folks have, you can feel free to reach out to Rachel about that directly or comment on the YouTube page there. So thank you all again. This is the last session for the fall semester, so we look forward to seeing you all in the spring.